Most people assume sacrifice is about punishment, that somewhere in the ancient world, a frightened civilization invented rituals to appease an angry god, and that the blood of animals was simply the price of superstition. That's the comfortable explanation, the one that keeps the story at a safe distance. But what if that's completely wrong? What if the sacrifice of an innocent lamb wasn't about appeasement at all, but about revelation? What if every altar, every ritual, every drop of blood recorded in the pages of biblical history was actually exposing something about the human condition that people today still haven't fully faced? This isn't a story about religion. It's a story about guilt, innocence, and the devastating cost of redemption. And by the end of it, the way you see one of the Bible's most familiar symbols will never be quite the same. There's a question that has haunted scholars, believers and skeptics for thousands of years, one that cuts right through the heart of biblical history. Why would a just God demand the death of something that had done absolutely nothing wrong? Not a warrior, not a tyrant, not someone who had broken a single law. Something small, something gentle, something that didn't even understand what was happening. And yet, deep within the oldest pages of the Old Testament, a pattern begins to surface. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Blood, always blood. Always innocent, and behind that pattern hides a truth far darker, far deeper than most people ever stop to consider. But to understand it, you have to go back to where it all began. Scan through the pages of biblical storytelling, from the earliest chapters of Genesis to the final visions of Revelation, and one creature keeps appearing. Not in the background, not as a passing detail, but always at the center of the most defining moments in biblical history. The Lamb, present when covenants were made, present when judgment fell, present when mercy was extended. Ancient Israel built an entire system of worship around it. And yet, most people read right past it, as if it were just an agricultural detail, a cultural habit, a relic of the ancient world. But what if it wasn't? What if this animal was never random? What if every single appearance was pointing to something or someone? And what did that sacrifice actually cost? This wasn't ritual. This wasn't metaphor, not back then. In the ancient world of Old Testament animals and biblical history, sacrifice was as real as the dust beneath your feet. The altar wasn't a symbol. It was a place where something living stopped breathing, where warmth became cold, where the weight of what was being done pressed down on everyone present. Ancient Israel understood something that modern minds struggle to grasp, that sin wasn't an idea to be debated. It was a debt, and debts in that world had a price. Priests didn't speak in abstractions. They worked with fire and stone and blood. Every family that came before the altar knew exactly what they were bringing and exactly what it meant. But not every animal was chosen. Only one kind, always the same kind. Picture it. Among the flock, one is chosen, not the weakest, not the forgotten one at the edge of the field. The one without blemish, without defect, without a single mark that could disqualify it. In the language of biblical animals, it had to be perfect, and that perfection was exactly why it was set apart. The priest's hands moved with purpose. The lamb didn't resist. It didn't understand what was coming. And that stillness, that complete, devastating innocence, made the moment unbearable to witness. There was no accusation in its eyes, no guilt, no reason for what was about to happen. It had simply been chosen, taken from the flock, separated from everything familiar. And as the silence settled around the altar, the question that no one dared to ask out loud began to rise. And then there was the other figure, the one who stood back, the one who had actually done something wrong, who had broken the law, crossed the line, carried the weight of real guilt. He didn't step forward to take what he deserved. Instead, he watched, because the system wasn't designed for the innocent to go free and the guilty to suffer. It was designed for something far more unsettling than that. The guilty stood untouched. The innocent took his place. And no one in ancient Israel could witness that exchange without feeling the raw, uncomfortable moral tension it created. This wasn't justice in any ordinary sense of the word. It was something else entirely. Something that demanded an explanation far deeper than tradition or ritual. Because if this was mercy, it came at a devastating price. And somewhere beneath the surface of that exchange, a deeper logic was beginning to take shape. Time seemed to slow. That's the only way to describe it. The altar, the fire, the silence that wrapped itself around everyone present like something physical, something you could feel pressing against your chest. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The lamb was there, still, unbothered by the gravity of what surrounded it. And the priest, steady hands, eyes that had seen this before and never fully grown numb to it, moved with the kind of deliberate slowness that comes not from hesitation, but from the full weight of understanding. This moment wasn't rushed. It was never rushed, because what was happening deserved to be felt, every second of it. And in that silence, something ancient and immovable made itself known, the cost of what stood between a holy God and a guilty people. But why this system? Why this way? This system didn't emerge from human tradition. It wasn't invented by priests looking for power or by a culture trying to appease the unknown. Deep within the pages of the Old Testament, the design was intentional, and its purpose was brutal in its honesty. Sin wasn't something that could simply be overlooked, not acknowledged, not filed away, not quietly forgotten. It carried weight, real weight, and the sacrifice wasn't meant to erase that weight. It was meant to make it visible. Every lamb that fell on that altar was a declaration. This is what guilt actually costs. Not an apology, not a feeling of remorse, life itself. And generation after generation, the same ritual repeated. Not because it was solving the problem, but because it was exposing it, keeping it in plain sight. Because the system was never designed to be the final answer. It was designed to make people desperate enough to look for one. But here's what made the most careful readers of biblical history stop and stare. The lamb kept dying, year after year, generation after generation. The altars never ran dry of blood, and yet nothing was permanently fixed. The guilt returned. The sacrifices resumed, and the prophets, the ones who saw further than most, began to speak in a language that felt almost impossible to contain. They weren't just describing a ritual. They were describing a shadow. Something casting its shape backward across centuries of Bible stories, a silhouette of something that hadn't arrived yet. The lamb, they seemed to suggest, was never meant to carry the full weight of what it was pointing toward. It was a placeholder, a sign pressed into the fabric of ancient Israel's history, repeating itself with quiet insistence. And if the lamb was only a shadow, then somewhere ahead there had to be a source of light, something or someone real enough to finally make it stop. And then the symbol began to speak. Not in the language of priests or rituals, but in the language of meaning. The lamb, stripped of its agricultural context, revealed something that had been embedded in biblical symbolism from the very beginning. Innocence, not weakness, not passivity, but a chosen, deliberate innocence. One that stood in the gap between guilt and consequence and absorbed what it never deserved. The spiritual meaning running through the Bible wasn't accidental. It was architectural, built into the oldest stories, woven through the fabric of ancient Israel's entire existence. And when you finally see it, really see it, the lamb stops being an animal. It becomes a language, a word the ancient world kept repeating in blood and fire and silence, because the concept was too enormous to express any other way. But a symbol, no matter how powerful, is still only a symbol. And somewhere in the unfolding of biblical history, the symbol was about to become something terrifyingly real. And then it happened. Not on an altar of stone, not in the controlled silence of a temple ritual, but on a hill, in the open, in front of a watching world that mostly didn't understand what it was seeing. The pattern that had run through centuries of biblical history, through every lamb, every sacrifice, every drop of blood spilled on every altar in ancient Israel, converged into a single moment. One man, no defect, no guilt, no reason by any moral logic for what was happening to him. And yet, like every lamb before him, he didn't resist. The weight of every sin ever committed pressed down on something that had never sinned. The final sacrifice wasn't announced with trumpets or temple ceremony. It arrived quietly and then violently and changed everything the Bible had ever been building toward. Every story, every symbol, every innocent animal that ever fell. It had all been leading here. But the question that remains the one that cuts deepest, isn't about the past at all. The sacrifice is accepted, the debt is paid, and millions of people across centuries have built their entire lives around that truth. But here's the question that lingers, the one that hangs in the air long after the story is told. How many of them have truly stopped to feel what it cost? It's possible to receive something and never fully reckon with its weight. To hold redemption in your hands like a gift you've already unwrapped and set aside. The lamb died. The innocent took the place of the guilty. And somewhere between ancient Israel and the modern world, that truth shifted from something visceral and devastating to something familiar, something comfortable, something that no longer demands anything from the people who claim it. And comfort, in the face of a sacrifice like this, might be the most dangerous response of all. And so the lamb stands, not as a relic of the ancient world, but as a mirror. One that reflects something every generation has tried to look away from. The cost of guilt, the weight of innocence sacrificed, the truth that redemption was never free. It was purchased at a price that should stop every single one of us in our tracks. But here's what's worth sitting with today. Do you see the lamb differently now? Does the symbol carry more weight than it did before? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is the kind of conversation that deserves more than silence. And if this story moved something in you, if it cracked open a question you hadn't thought to ask before, then there's so much more waiting for you on this channel. Subscribe, turn on the notifications, because the Bible is full of stories like this one, ancient, buried, and more alive than most people realize. Don't miss what's coming next.